Welcome, Jasun Horsley. Jasun is the author of a fantastic series of books, including The Fight of Kings, which is about socialism, occultism, and sexual revolution, engineered a culture of abuse, generally to do with the Fabian Society. Also, Prisoner of Infinity, regarding UFO, social engineering, and the psychology of fragmentation. And most recently, he has produced Big Mother and the Technological Body of Evil. Now, some of these books are available on his website, autoculture.com, and some of them are available as where he talks through sort of as an audio book too, which is a fantastic way of sort of getting the information. His other books include the likes of Matrix Warrior, Paper Tiger, Dark Oasis, Seen and Not Seen, Kubricon, The 16 Maps of Hell, Lucid Few, Occult History of DNA, The Blood Poets, The Secret Life of Movies, and there's a full list of his books at his website, autoculture.com. That's AUTICULTURE.com. Welcome, Jasun.
Oh, yeah,
Okay.
Thanks, Josie. Welcome. I mean, thanks for welcoming me.
I'm
Sorry, you made me stutter now. It's because the website Autoculture is actually an old one. It's still up, but the current website is landmademan.com, and then my Substack is Children of Job.
Oh, thank you. And on the Substack and the Children of Job, you put out a weekly newsletter with recordings as well. So there, it's a fabulous way of getting into contact with the work that you're doing. One of the things that you've brought my attention to the likes of Job in the Bible, and how he kind of went through this, I suppose, this dark night of the soul, where the Lucifer and the devil basically wage a bet with God to put some good man in through the all manner of horrors, to see if he will lose faith. And I think a lot of us are kind of feeling sort of in that kind of situation at the moment. So look, I'm struck that the topics of the subjects in your books sort of bring together a series of sort of topics which kind of all relate to this Job character, and also this mass narcissistic operation that we seem to be seeing with the likes of our governments at the moment, including gaslighting, mass formation psychosis, blame shifting. And we understand the playbook. It was drafted maybe initially by the Fabian Society. Now, you have deep links with the Fabian Society. Now, by looking at this, it kind of helps us understand how to negotiate this current situation, and we can explore kind of what are the solutions to deal with being gaslit in this way. And you also examine evil as a term, which you define clearly as Ahriman. Ahriman has also been defined quite extensively by Rudolf Steiner. I see this as an eruption of narcissists, including spiritual and sociopaths, and their giddy rise from evil claims sort of as this symptom of the rise of Ahriman and the counterfeit soul at this time of the fourth turning. How do you define the impact of Ahriman?
Well, maybe I'll get to that. I'll just address some of the things you said, because you mentioned a number of different things there. I was thinking of using the title Earth by Gaslight a while back. I can't remember which book it was, but certainly I would agree that that's a really key or essential strand to understanding our predicament, is that we are being gaslit, and we have been gaslit for generations, collectively and individually. And I'm going to connect that to what you mentioned then also about me having deep links to Fabian Society, because people could interpret that a number of ways. What you're referring to there is that I was born and raised in a Fabian affiliated family. Specifically, my paternal grandfather was a founding member of the local Fabian Society, not the whole thing, obviously, because that was well, not before he was born. Well, it was even maybe before he was born, actually, yeah, like 1880s. So I grew up without realizing it in that environment of what we knew of then as champagne socialists, like high power entrepreneurs and rubbing shoulders with leading politicians and this kind of family and artists and other prominent figures in Britain. That was the environment I grew up in, and very, pioneers of liberal progressivism at that time. And so I was aware from my teen years on, at least, that there was a lot of hypocrisy in my family, i.e., that they espoused certain values that they didn't necessarily practice, which of course is central to the Fabian Society, MO, modus operandi, the wolf in sheep's clothing. But I just kind of unpack that in order to give an example of being gaslit, that I was growing up in an environment of gaslighting because I was being told one thing and shown another, which I think is very central to how gaslighting works and why it is so central as a method for splitting us. Because if we're seeing one thing and being told another, we're also being told that we're not supposed to be seeing what we're seeing, or that we're not seeing what we're seeing, or that if we really insist on believing that we're seeing what we're seeing, we can't talk about it. We don't talk about it. There's a narrative that's being imposed upon us that goes contrary to what our senses are telling us, and that is effective, obviously, in a number of obvious ways in terms of covering up crimes, but it's effective at this deep psychosocial level for creating a split or a gulf in people's psyches, whereby they can't trust the evidence of the senses, or they don't dare to refer to the evidence of their senses because their senses are telling them one thing, whereas the powers that be from parents on up are telling them another. So anyway, that to me is closer to my sense of how I would define evil. It's the imposition of false narratives that distorts our reality and makes us complicit with reality distortion. To me, and in the Bible, that Satan's referred to as the father of lies. So that's fairly close to a theological definition, I think, of evil is lies and distortions of truth, including maybe especially counterfeits of truth that make us. As far as Ahriman goes, that's something I got from Rudolf Steiner. Like, I hadn't heard of Ahriman. It's a Persian name for kind of malevolent.
Jason, if we can just tease these different, I want to talk about Ahriman, but the concept that you've just discussed there, it's actually quite huge, and something that actually just deserves a bit of sort of distillation. Now, it's like that comment that we heard: disregard the evidence of your eyes and ears. But in especially the fragile child's mind, whenever you see that level of contradiction, that basically that shocks you into position of that hypocrisy, where you're saying one thing and you're doing another. Now, it develops what's known as an alter, where basically there's like two personalities. It's a split personality that kind of evolves, and that's something that these Fabians and this what you're talking about, this this split personality thing, this hypocrisy is that's a form. It's a form of child abuse, because it's like saying to a child, this is the chocolate bar, and actually giving them a something that's covered in chili powder. It sort of, and then they dissociate from that, and then they develop a fear of chocolate bars, because they've been told one thing and they've experienced another. Now, with that, with the Fabian Society and this fracturing of the personality with this lying and this deceitfulness, you go into great detail, and great horrific detail. It's quite horrific to read this, of what Alfred Kinsey did in his examination with children in these Fabian connected schools, which are, with the likes of, you said, sort of Marianne Faithfull used to go to, Mick Jagger used to go to, all of these big names in the, in the 1960s and 1970s that have carried forward, which brought brought in the sexual revolution. So there's no coincidence here. But and sort of we can sort of see also the work of these thoughts of Alfred Kinsey in these world, I don't know whether you've seen these, Jason, but the World Health Organization have brought out guidelines for the sexual development of children age 0 upwards, and it's about the sexualization of children. These are guidelines that went into schools and are national and international guidelines for the development of children, and it's quite shocking reading. So how does that feed into, how does this all correlate?
Well, it's certainly a visible face of evil, I would say, and it's a good example of how we've been gaslit to the extent that we're not really, it's not politically correct to say that the progressivist approach to sexual education is the face of evil. It's basically, it's being sold to us as something good. It's supposed to liberate children and help them to find their true identities and blah blah blah, yada yada. Everybody knows the rationalizations, whether or not they believe them. And yeah, this does go back quite far. It certainly is fairly easy and even somewhat in the common knowledge of political kind of discourse that the idea that sexual repression was at the root of political oppression. Even Wilhelm Reich writing about fascism being rooted in sexual oppression. This idea then leads to the supposed solution, which is if you liberate people, children, liberate in quotes, of sexual shame. If you sexualize them early, then they won't develop sexual shame, and therefore they won't become little dictators, or they won't be able to be susceptible to a kind of fascist state. So socialism for a long time, and Marxism, and these ideas that we generally associate with the left and with progressivism, have had the idea of sexual liberation as being key to a kind of political revolution. But it goes further back, really, and certainly further back than Kinsey, which is Havelock Ellis, who was one of the founding members of the Fabian Society. And he was a forerunner of Kinsey, who was less well known because he didn't write bestsellers the way that Kinsey did in America. Kinsey, by the way, was a Crowley, I don't know about a follower exactly, but let's just say a fan of Aleister Crowley. Crowley is the subject, the focus of the second part of The Vice of Kings. But Havelock Ellis, who was a contemporary of Crowley, more or less, he's older actually. He wrote a massive treatise on sexual studies, and, for example, coined the term homosexual and other. I mean, he was a pioneer of the depathologizing of sexual pathologies, let's say, and he had it seems as though one can extrapolate, I mean, by directly quoting of the philosophy that Havelock Ellis had, which was to do with sexual perversion being the supreme expression of human individuality, based on the reasoning that what separates human beings from animals is that they can make choices that go against nature. I'm totally extrapolating here. I'm not saying he said this part, but I think it's reasonable to deduce this was his reasoning, and so thereby the ways in which human beings make choices that go against their biological programming is an expression of human individuality, and therefore of humanness. And he particularly singled out sexual perversity, seeing as the sex drive is such a strong drive in all creatures, biological creatures, or mammals, let's say, and therefore the ways in which human beings explore sexuality is likely to be a sort of petri dish for this development of the individuality. So this could be then tracked back to your question or your point about fragmentation and the creation of an altar. You could say, and I never said this before, but I think it's reasonable, that the creation of the false self, the conditioned self, which is the one that social engineering is geared through trauma genesis, is geared to create in human beings in order to make them let's say, puppets of a hidden agenda, that I forgot what I was saying now, that has to do with pathologizing their sexuality. It's a kind of sexual identity which has these pathological sexual drives that are supposedly expressions of their individuality, but it's a false individuality. It's an individuality that goes against nature, and therefore against God, you could say, because it goes against the body. So it's an anti-self, really, a negative self. So that's demonic. I mean, that's satanic. I mean, just in the broad sense of those terms. And this does map on, if we wanted to go there, onto Steiner's idea of Ahriman, because Steiner believed and talked about how there's an Ahrimanic double, which is to say a being that comes from Ahriman, like one of Ahriman's minions, that inserts itself into the human fetus before birth, and that so we all are possessed before birth, Steiner believed, by Ahriman. And then the social engineering, you could say, is a way to nurture and develop and utilize, exploit that Ahrimanic double. And I mean, it's we could say Ahriman is working on the outside as well as the inside through these social engineering agendas to create a species that is like this pathological negative identity self, trauma driven, to achieve all of its, or feed all of its appetites, primarily sexual, but then in terms of ambition and drive to control and dominate and conquer. So all the menu of pathologies that we see running our society, I think to some degree they can all be traced back to this. So then bringing it back to where we started, which was the school programs of sexual education, that I think that is the face of Ahriman. Lucifer's in there too, but anyway, this agenda is becoming visible and going public, and then that's a sort of a new level of gaslighting, because there are many parents now who are horrified by this, understandably, but they find it very hard to stand up for their principles, because there's so much pressure to go along with it, and because it's being framed as kind of hate crime and intolerance if you question it. And beyond that, at an even deeper level, many of these parents have been so indoctrinated with the sexual ideology that came from Ellis and Kinsey and these other things, and that has metastasized as the LGBTQT movement. They've internalized those values, so then they feel internally divided. They feel like, am I being intolerant? Do I have hate? Do I have prejudice because I think my 4-year-old daughter shouldn't be taught about anal sex? So maybe I'm exaggerating to make a point. I don't know how bad it's got, but it's pretty extreme.
Actually, that would be fairly sort of minor in comparison to sort of what I was reading in the legislation. It was about sexually children that are sort of 0 to 6 months of age, that they were to be stimulated by the adults. I mean, it's fairly horrific stuff. I mean, it's a step on from your Kinsey kind of a situation. But I mean, I think it's interesting whenever we're talking about the Fabian Society, sort of who they were. Now, they were basically located in a very small area, but the connection of Crowley is enough to put fear into my soul, So, I mean, he was described quite suitably as the most evil man alive. But the fact that this guy keeps turning up in all of these popular culture ways, and you do still see people that are sort of trying to be cool in popular culture, and so then they talk about Crowley because that's the place to go to, and that still gives me chills. Now we have even looking at the Americans and their government, and I mean, it's said by some that Barbara Bush, George Bush's wife, was actually Aleister Crowley's son. So
and Paul McCartney, the replacement Paul, apparently allegedly claims to be Crowley's son. I don't know if we can put any stock in this, but.
Well, apparently there's there are descendants of him certainly in this. I'd spoken to Bob Osborne from the, he lives in he lives in D.H. Lawrence's house in Zenar, so he has that other connection with the whole Fabian Society and its connections. I mean, the Fabian Society also connects to the likes of Jimmy Savile and so forth, and all of these cover-ups. So it's it's, to be honest, for anybody, just dig into this book because it covers so much ground. It's something that we all need to be really looking at, but it gives us the opportunity to maybe explore this Fabian agenda and how this was drafted 100 years ago and how it is impacting everything that we see at the moment. I was just saying to Jason, I just read the Behold a Pale Horse, and we can sort of see the fingerprints of the Fabian agenda all over this. And this attack on cultural and family cohesion, because we're being shamed that such things are, the backward. They're sort of they're a backwards move. It's like the government of Ireland. They brought out a statement saying about they regarded that sovereignty was a backwards notion. So so these are conversations. It's funny that we're having these kind of conversations because we're at astrology wise, we're at what's known as sort of the fourth turning. Pluto has gone into Aquarius, so we're at a time where we can sort of maybe really reassess all of these principles that are being presented to us out of the blue, and it's like, well, where did they come to from these? Because we didn't vote for it, So, but I'm fascinated by all of these concepts, like the likes of these altars. That's whenever the personality of the child is fractured. So, and that develops through this abuse. Now that develops different personalities, and you would hear about people talking about altars. The likes of some of the actors would have them, but also people like the Secret Space Program and all of these other programs. But they all seem to be connected with that. You have a really interesting concept with regards to that too, don't you, Jason?
I guess so. I think that it's very important. I mean, specific on this last point, but also all these other points. It's really essential to always refer back to our experience and check it that way. Obviously, there's fact checking, and that's a very difficult thing, but it's not entirely impossible. Always check your sources and then follow the sources back as far back as you can, and then determine how good the original source is for whatever it is, such as with Behold a Pale Horse. I don't think that's very well cited, that book. Right? Vice of Kings, I tried very hard to cite the best sources possible, with the awareness that you can't trust institutional sources anyway, but at least it's within the realm of sort of mainstream admissions to things, or direct, first-hand experience if possible. So with the altars, that's something that I would say, so far as I understand it and the way in which I approach it, it's something that's universal, that nobody escapes the kind of psychological fragmentation today on this planet unless you're literally living in the Amazon forest somewhere in a tribe. If you're completely cut off from the global village, then maybe, but then there'd be different circumstances. But so we all have some experience of it, and that, on the one hand, that makes it extremely hard to really understand it, because if you yourself are fragmented, how can you understand what a fragment is, right? You need to understand the whole, and you need to have the sense of what it is to be whole, to understand how psychological fragmentation works, what it's like to be an alter, right? Can an alter really know what it's like to be an alter? It's like, can a fish know what it's like to be a fish? It's just, it's all it's ever known. So that's the downside, but the upside is, well, if it's happened to us, we can observe ourselves closely and see the ways in which we're not playing with the full deck. So then, in some way, I mean, my endeavor with writing books has been to always come back to that, to my own psyche, as in I'm the person writing this book and I'm trying to heal this fragmentation by understanding it, not knowing if that will work, but I don't know how else to proceed, right? And then so the lens through which we're looking at these things, Fabian Society or whatever else it is, Kinsey, the agendas, the World Economic Forum, UFO, alien abductions, whatever it is, the lens through which we're looking at these things is fractured. It's a fractured lens. So we're always going to be seeing the thing in fragments. And it's been fractured in a very specific way. It's been intentionally, to a large degree. The trauma genesis is applied trauma. Like, it's not just happening because things are fucked up. It's actually being intentionally inflicted upon psyches collectively and individually in order to control the fragmentation and then create these alters that can then be managed and handled. So that's to be, I mean, that's very hard. You can't be too aware of that. You can't overestimate the importance of that fact, because the way in which we're going to try and get to the truth about the way we've been traumatized and brainwashed, to keep it simple, to a large degree, that's going to be factored into two things: the way in which we've been fractured and fragmented so that we won't find the truth, and the way in which the information is reaching us, the narratives that are reaching us, even before we interpret them. They're to a large degree, they're going to be designed, just as the cover-up is designed to prevent us getting to the truth. The way in which the evidence does reach us when we start to see beyond the cover-up, the spiked ground is a way to keep it simple. Like in gold mining, they talk about spiking the ground. You put gold dust or gold nuggets in the ground to fool gold hunters into thinking that there's a pay streak, but there isn't, because other gold hunters found the pay streak and then they went and put some gold where it isn't. So that's very much what I call the second matrix. That's the thing that's I think is most essential to be aware of, besides what I said about our own fractured lens, when we're trying to see the truth darkly through this fragmented lens, by looking at the sources of information, such as Behold a Pale Horse or books by Horsley or whatever they are, that they're, even if they're sincerely created, these narratives, they're shaped by people who've been traumatized and who are subject to delusion, right? They make mistakes, but a lot of them aren't sincerely created. A lot of the material out there is these spikers of the ground who are putting maybe fool's gold or maybe real gold where it's not actually sourced, to lure people into honey traps and into these second matrix narratives where they think they're getting to the truth. Like QAnon is obviously a big example. We could see something with Pizzagate like this was going on. There was a mix of truth with disinformation, with fake narratives stuck in there and fake evidence, so that the most dedicated truth seeker can just end up like a headless chicken. And this, add to this that the truth itself in these areas, in terms of planet Earth as a social level, is deranging anyway. If you could get the truth neat, undiluted, uncut about what's going on behind the scenes and has been going on for hundreds, if not thousands of years, it would be deranging. It would be so overwhelming in its pure form. Never mind when it's cut. Cocaine or heroin is pretty dangerous pure, but it's not really better if it's cut and diluted with bleach, or washing up powder or whatever it is. So it's such a minefield, this gaslighting that's gone on for hundreds of years, and it's a mistake, I would say, to think that whatever's going on astrologically, that there's some sort of awakening to the truth currently. Because the awakening can't happen at a cognitive level. I would say it's not enough simply to find the facts and put them together and say, okay, now we know what's going on. It has to correspond with an internal shift whereby we're actually being able to process these discoveries internally and psychologically by finding the corresponding trauma in our own bodies and healing that. Right? Because we're all victims of Jimmy Savile and Jeffrey Epstein, even if it's not directly and literally. We're all victims of these programs, and we're continuing to be victimized, not just by the lies, but also by the supposed disclosures, because the conspiratainment has its own allure, and it's its own kind of trap. Like David Icke is my easy go-to example. Much of what he said over the years turns out it was probably true. I never really doubted that he was probably talking about true stuff, but I never trusted him as a source, not because I think he's lying, but either, or that he's working for. Or Russell Brand is a better contemporary example, because Russell Brand has his own Fabian affiliations, indisputably. New Spectator is a Fabian publication that's about Russell Brand, or he's written for it, what have you. And there are other, I think, indications. And Russell Brand, I don't know where he's at now with the recent allegations, but he certainly appears to be, for, I would say, the undiscerning or naive eye, he appears to be a truth teller and a whistleblower who's helping people to wake up to reality. But if he's, or Joe Rogan, there's plenty of leading, very well placed figures. If they're useful, if they're as successful and as well known as they are, then they must be useful to the larger controlling agendas. Otherwise, they wouldn't be able to do what they're doing. So that always has to be questioned. How is it useful? How is it possible to weaponize truth and to co-opt and hijack and redirect a collective awakening at this social level to reality of what's going on in such a way that the individuals and the groups who are becoming more conscious will themselves be weaponized, that they will self-destruct, or they will become somehow useful to the agendas. Like QAnon is useful, or was useful, because it reinforces the idea of the deplorables and white supremacy and conspiracy nuts being dangerous and so on and so forth.
Yeah, I mean, again, it brings everything back to, I mean, for anybody who's trying to make sense of it, it's if they've dealt with a narcissist or a sociopath, then all of the same kind of scenarios are going on here, but just on a bigger level, the likes of crazy making and reactive abuse and so forth, sort of. But it's just like, well, how do we deal with it? Sort of. You were mentioning Ahriman, and it's difficult to get a really cohesive kind of a handle on Ahriman and the damage that he does. I mean, apart from the lies, now what Steiner discusses in his study was basically that he believes that that we were being eased, that the world was being eased to create a perfect kind of environment for Ahriman to manifest in this century. So that's why there is a rise in narcissism. That's how I sort of have pulled it together from my own understanding of his reading. And you also I'd like to talk maybe a bit more about the counterfeit soul, to try and get more of a connection with that, because it's a very abstract kind of a topic that you sort of mention.
Well, I don't know if I've used that term, but it does. I think those two areas do intersect, like the idea that Ahriman engenders narcissism as a means to his or its ends, and the second idea of a counterfeit soul. One thing I know that Steiner spoke about with Ahriman was that the agenda, or it's difficult to talk about this really, because we're not talking about human beings. We're talking about sort of energetic metaphysical forces that have psychological correspondences, so it's psychological currents in a way rather than actual individual forces. But anyway, what's unfolding has to do with, according to Steiner, with the fragmentation, both of individuals into many parts that can then be controlled, pitted against each other, kept in the dark, and whatever else goes on we've been touching on with the psychological fragmentation of programs like MKUltra, with the fragmentation of the collective, or balkanization of humanity, whereby what Steiner believed would happen in the end would be that every individual would have a counterfeit or an illegitimate kind of clairvoyance bestowed upon him or her by Ahriman and or Lucifer. I'm not quite clear on how they would work together here, but anyway, they would see visions, and they would feel that they were tuning into higher realities via their psychic powers that were being bestowed upon them. The psychedelic movement comes to mind here. But these visions that each individual had would be completely divorced from any empirical reality. There'd be subjective psychic visions that essentially they were hallucinations, would be the simple way of saying it, that didn't correspond with anything objective. So as Steiner foresaw it, the human collective would become more and more fragmented, and each individual would become more and more isolated in this bubble in which they would believe they were perceiving reality and interacting with it, even at a spiritual level, but they wouldn't be. They'd actually be like in the Matrix, they'd be in these little pods, hallucinating a reality and interacting only with either NPCs, basically non-sentient programs created by Ahriman, however that works, and or demonic entities posing as human beings. I'm extrapolating now because Steiner didn't go into what it would actually be like. The main point was just this, that that human beings would become more and more isolated from one another without knowing it, and in tandem with believing that they were becoming more and more aware and awake and spiritually conscious. Now that's possible to see that happening, I would say, through the medium of technology, the global village of the internet, that we might feel more and more connected and more able to access things that we wouldn't be able to access, not literally psychism, but sort of information that is beyond our normal powers of all five senses to access via the technology. But we are becoming more and more isolate in the process, as in we're just interacting with the technology rather than with each other. And then, of course, introduce into this the AI programs and deep fakes and all the rest of it make it theoretically and even, I would say, experientially possible for us to be interacting only with non-sentient programs without knowing it. So that's the big mother technological body of evil, and how that corresponds with Ahriman. And that has to do, as far as I can understand it, and sort of finish this rather dark prognosis, with the harvesting of the human soul, harvesting of consciousness, which is, I think, the closest synonym we have for the soul, really, is the consciousness that transcends the body, potentially, but needs the body in order to be embodied and to be incarnate as an individual and develop individual awareness. That consciousness can be harvested in this way by creating these traps in which we believe we're giving ourselves, giving our attention, giving our life force, giving our awareness to spiritual dimensions or gods and other human beings, whereas in fact we're just giving it into the technology, and the technology itself is an instrument created through human beings that are possessed by Ahriman as a vehicle for Ahriman, or as a kind of a hoover anyway for Ahriman to siphon off that energy of consciousness through the technology into it's called the eighth sphere in Steiner's model, but anyway, into the non-physical realms, wherever some objective reality that corresponds to Ahriman actually exists.
Yeah, this is a very interesting topic, because it's kind of where we're going to be going to probably next. What these guys are sort of developing, this whole AI, was it God of all things, the goat? Of course, it's the goat. It's it's the Baphomet. So, but there was an interesting sort of throwaway concept that was developed by a guy called Jerry Wills in a conversation with William Stick Evers, and William had said that he sees that there'll be a change in who we define as being our creator. And Jerry had said, wouldn't it be interesting, or the way things are going, what if the AI in ChatGPT read all of the religious manuals, and then basically it deciphered and presented a sort of a God concept to the people that were contacting them, so basically it was like a development of like a creator egregore online, and we can sort of see how that could be developed using the likes of this narcissistic kind of identity theft, and then of course gaslighting us, stating that this computer is the god of all things, so that's probably the next sort of step down the road from us. I read an interesting book there in the last couple of days. It was I'm not too sure how to pronounce the name of it, but it's The Apocalypse of Yajna Valka, and I kind of know by reading it it's that it's certainly it's been assisted by AI in the development of the writing of it. It's just in the way that it has some very interesting concepts, sort of in the third and the fourth chapters. The third chapter, in this book, it's like an American version. I would say probably taking an awful lot from your own work in the Vice of Kings. That kind of a concept. It's sort of the American version of sort of Jimmy Savile, and then also it's sort of like where do we go to from here. So again, it's kind of following what you've been doing in terms of sort of personal sovereignty and about basically removing ourselves from the matrix and basically developing that whole cultural cohesion again and sort of like who we are and the best way forward. So how do we deal with this? I mean, we're being gaslit from our government, and I think the only thing is just to step out of the matrix and sort of reconnect with ourselves. But I mean, that's going to be probably outlawed. So what are your own thoughts on this now, Jasun?
Well, I think it's a case of one can only really talk about, this is true of everything, but maybe more so in this case, what one has actually already done. One has to kind of show by example rather than tell, otherwise it's very hollow. And so it's a bit early for me to really talk about how to unplug from the matrix, as I used to talk about it in Matrix Warrior, much more naive times, by getting off the grid and living on the land and so on. And in the very early stages of that in Galicia, and we're still 100% dependent on the system here. I mean, we do grow food and we do have animals, but so we have our own eggs, and it makes a difference, but it doesn't make us. Maybe I'd say we're 98% dependent, or even 95%. A vineyard, I just got a vineyard, so hopefully we'll be growing grapes this year, and potentially then we could make wine. Certainly we could sell the grapes. So the transitional period then is without actually becoming completely self-sufficient, is to become to have a revenue that is of intrinsic value that isn't cash, right? So one isn't dependent on the system for money then, because one is creating a produce, a vegetable, animal, or mineral that is of value to others, and then being hooked into the local community, which there is here in Galicia. People who are living the way that people have lived for hundreds of years, more or less. Obviously, they have some extra perks on top of it, but they're still doing the same things that they were doing hundreds of years ago. And so that's a much more realistic template, I think, for self-sufficiency as part of a community, whereby combined, everybody basically is producing everything that's needed for the time when things should collapse or just become completely untenable. If it's a digital currency, for example, then you can't buy or sell anything without the mark of the beast. So So that's the practical answer, which, as I say, I can only talk about the level that I'm at, which is still baby steps. Although, I mean, the transitional period does involve, and I hope can involve for us, introducing people to this possibility, and having a retreat area center where people can come and learn more about it and have a taste of what it's like to live without the technology, without all these distractions, because that's as a big an obstacle as any, as we're addicted now to the stimulation of the media, technical electrical media. We're addicted to Ahriman's tools and his, the perks and the bells and whistles that he's given us. So that's what I'm involved in, and to some degree, and hopefully it will become more experiential, as in I can talk more about what it is, but also people can come and see for themselves in the future. Fingers crossed. Beyond that, then the question is, well, how do we live in the system? How do we change the way we live in the system in the meantime? And that would include, how do we use the technology? What kind of things do we talk about? How do we approach information? And I've touched on this today, that it's not like the truth isn't information based. The truth isn't an assemblage of facts. This is my view anyway, and I think it's self-evident, unless I was speaking to a nihilist or a reductionist or something who just thought that all there was a bunch of objects in the world and nothing eternal. But in which case it doesn't matter. I mean, if nothing's eternal, it really makes no difference, anything. So assuming or allowing that there is an eternal element in here at stake, the soul, then the truth is something that's innate to all of us, that is within, that we can access and have permanent access to 24/7 all the time, that doesn't change on the one hand because it's eternal, and on the other hand is constantly changing because to apply the truth or the sense of what is true and real in each moment, it changes. Each moment changes, so the kind of truth or the way in which we need to apply the truth changes. So that has to do with improvisation and spontaneity, that only the soul can really achieve that kind of level of spontaneity that can respond to each moment in a way that's true, and therefore optimize our performance physically and emotionally and psychologically, so that we always come out not ahead, because it's not a race, but we come out in the right way. We end up in the right place for the next moment. That's a sort of spiritual discipline, and as I said, that has nothing to do with facts or gathering information. It doesn't even have to do with spiritual knowledge. Even the Bible, if you're a Christian, or even if you're not, but like me, I mean, you value the text of the Bible, the Gospel, particularly. Even that has to be dispensable. Like, you don't need the knowledge that's in the Bible to connect to the truth, but it can help. And if and when you connect to the truth directly, you certainly don't need any of these things, but they might still be useful as reference points. So that's an extreme example for a Christian, or for somebody who really feels that there is sacred wisdom in books, and I think it's possible. But a less extreme example is what we're talking about today, is the gathering of information to increase knowledge about what's happening to us parapolitically and metaphysically. That can be useful, but it's certainly not enough. And part of it not being enough is that it's not essential. Like, one could find one's way out of this Ahrimanic, Luciferian, dissociative nightmare dream world without any of the knowledge. I believe. I mean, I can't prove it because that's not the path I've taken, but I can say that I gathered knowledge for years and it was useless. Actually, it was worse than useless, because it wasn't good knowledge, right? It was contaminated. So then, well, go ahead. I saw you unmuted.
Yeah, that's interesting. I suppose I'm kind of seeing that the Bible has a lot of interesting concepts for us, but again, it's come out of this deception, you know. So the likes of these guys wearing the black frocks, sort of in mourning, you know, sort of this whole again, they it just seems so Luciferian. So I mean, I think one of the things that we can do is take, see, what we have is the Bible has kind of placated us as people as being good people, and I mean we can still be good people, but it's kind of like turn the other cheek. I mean, and this kind of this Ahrimanic kind of and Luciferian attitude and this narcissism that can only exist when there's people like us that are turning the other cheek and walking away as opposed to sticking it to them. So
Maybe,
because
but I mean, it depends what you mean by turning the other cheek, because it sounds like you're making it equivalent with turning away or looking away or ignoring or being passive. But turning the other cheek isn't being passive. Turning the other cheek is really saying to the abuser and the oppressor, go ahead, do your worst. You can't hurt. You can't hurt what is in me, or what I truly am cannot be hurt by whatever you do. And that, well, that's true. That is true. Like the spirit can't be corrupted or co-opted or contaminated by any of this. So to me, turning the other cheek, although it can certainly be misused and misapplied, um, but I mean the phrase can be misused and the understanding of it can be faulty, and then it's misapplied into passivity and stuff. But to me, actually, that is the most essential principle: resist not evil. That is the most essential thing that we need to know, I would say, in terms of navigating evil, is you don't resist it.
I've been having conversations today to do with there's an old tribal sort of warriors called the Fena over here in Ireland. So and again it connects to sort of our power within our land and our mythology and all of this kind of powerful kind of thing. And I see a lot of what these guys are trying to do, even in terms of dismissing our votes in democracy and this abuse, this insidious, repulsive abuse of vulnerable children and the impacts of it, that this is all to do with taking away our power. And the more I look into it, the more this is sort of, it just becomes that they have to fragment, they have to destroy the child so utterly at such a vulnerable age that the child can never fully develop and never fully step into his power. You know, with this breaking down of cultural cohesion, you know, the sort of the taking away of the state, the taking away of the boundaries, the taking away of our cultural identity is is just more evidence of them trying to take away our power. And I suppose I'm kind of wondering, like, how do we regain that? I mean, we see these images of the likes of um, the likes of Crowley and so forth, and his he popping up on places like the Sergeant Pepper's album and so forth. That these guys have been steering culture for more than 100 years, and the impacts of this abuse, how it goes back. I mean, it's not about developing people that are strong, that are culturally cohesive. It's about taking all of that away from us. They're basically, it's to sort of enslave us, but to break us down, to fragment who we are at a molecular level, and even the likes of sort of taking these ingestibles and these that literally that they want to that they want to sort of enslave us at a molecular sort of point where sort of we are weakened all the way through. We were sort of listening to you talking about how you have sort of stepped out of the kind of the grid and sort of developing your own life. And I think that's something that a lot of us are kind of looking at and kind of doing in our own way. But it's just like, well, where is beyond the grid? Where can we be safe to live our Western European lives, in our own culture, to be sort of and to be sort of socially and spiritually empowered? What do you think, Jason?
Yeah, I don't think there is a place, Josie, really. I mean, I talked about Galicia because I wanted to talk about experience and be practical about this question. So certainly there are places that are relatively better. But if we're thinking generationally, like I don't have children, but if I did, I'd have to be thinking, well, you know, what's it going to be like here 50 years from now, or even 20 years? And I suppose I do have to think that far ahead for myself. And well, you know, either the agenda continues to unfold because they find some alternative fuel source and so on and so forth, that they manage to keep pushing the agenda as long and as far as they want to, or at least for another 50 years, in which case there'll be no corner, there'll be no grain of sand that hasn't been, you know, whatever, tagged with the mark of the beast. Or it doesn't and it collapses, in which case we're looking at something, I would say, far preferable, but still pretty scary in terms of, you know, roving bandits and, you know, the zombie apocalypse, really, people eating each other in order to survive. So I don't think that there is a good forecast for humanity, human beings collectively, either way. I don't think there's anywhere you can go where you can just say, well, that's it. You know, I can relax now for the next 20 years. Even just the last few years with the mRNA thing, well, you don't know wherever you end up that they're not going to hunt you down and knock on your door with a needle in their hand and hold you down and force you to take it. Like it's not beyond the realms of possibility. Or more, perhaps more realistically, you know, make it put it in the chemtrails, what have you, so it just floats down and we breathe this nanotech. So I don't think there is any escaping it at this level that we're currently, most of us, currently apprehending reality, if you like cognitively, but also what we think of as physical reality. If we think of physical reality in this reductionist way that we've been given by our handlers over the centuries, admittedly with lots of bells and whistles and, you know, jingle jangles, whether it's Jung or whether it's quantum mechanics or whatever, they've certainly tried to make a sort of basically materialistic view of reality a lot sexier and funkier, and they've given us the new age and all the rest of it. So we've got this faux spirituality, but I'd say that's still a kind of materiality, really. Like they even want to make the soul into plasmic energy or something. Everything has to be measured. That's Ahrimanic too. Everything has to be quantified and numerized, and then it can be controlled, and it can be, you know, mapped. So we're all, to the extent that we're in that matrix, that delusion or that narrative that's been imposed upon us at such a deep level that we literally can't think outside of it, then I would say that there is no hope. There is no hope because we're going to be trying to use the very tools that imprison us to get free. And the more we use them and rely on them, the more imprisoned we are. I mean, the second matrix, in a way, is worse than the first matrix because you think you're free in the second matrix. I mean, some people in the first matrix think they are. Sorry to use matrix analogies because they're very tainted now. But in terms, you know, they've got the mainstream narrative, which is trusted authorities, and that's less and less believable now. So they've got the second sort of controlled opposition narrative, or many of these really, but together they make up the counter narrative, which is whatever it is, you know, the equivalent of free thinking, of independent thought, that usually centers around one charismatic figure or another. And yeah, all of these are traps and snares. The only way out is to think outside I can't use the word paradigm because that's part of the co-opting, but that illustrates my point. But well, let's say not refer to thinking at all, then be more radical. But of course, this has also been trivialized and turned into the part of the new age as well. This isn't about eschewing logic and wishful thinking, but it has to do with I should really crunch this down, otherwise I'm not even answering your question. But there's a signal within each one of us which comes from the soul. I'm talking poetically now, so I can keep it simple, and that leads to the soul. So it's like a beacon. It's like a calling signal of the soul. That if we, the more we tune into it, the more we can hear it, the more we can follow it, and it leads us back to the soul. And that's the only solution. And the soul, if it means anything, then it means something that can't be quantified, that can't be implanted, that can't be vaccinated, that can't be imprisoned, that isn't restricted to the time-space continuum as we understand it, like what I'm saying, this paradigm we've got trapped in. So the soul isn't imprisoned, and it isn't oppressed. To a degree, currently it is, because we ourselves are not giving it our attention. So it's trapped because we ourselves are trapped. So it can't incarnate and embody and be what it is. It's in this kind of limbo. So in a certain sense, the soul is trapped, but only because we're not living it, we're not embodying it. To be fully embodying the soul is to become fully free, even, well, I say in the physical world, but I mean, one could, like the early apostles, one could end up, or Christ, one could end up, in prison or literally nailed to a cross physically. But paradoxically, I'd say one would still be physically free, as the soul would experience that as not compromising its freedom. And I know that sounds crazy and absurd, but that is the Christian. The meaning of the crucifixion is that Christ, to become fully human, performed the ultimate sacrifice, right? But that was how Jesus became Christ. Like, to be willing to be crucified is to be willing to submit to the oppressive regime of matter. It is oppressive to the mind, but not to the soul, is what I'm going to say. So what's this mind that feels oppressed by matter?
Well, that's interesting. I've been sort of thinking and sort of delving into all of these topics, and the likes of the spirit, and and even the likes of Jesus, because I'm kind of really inclined to think that the likes of with a narcissist, a narcissist basically has a step in, and I've been reading into this and sort of thinking, do you know what, this is this character that there's very little written about. Really, nobody has a big tangible sort of connection to a guy called Mephistopheles, and which is mentioned in sort of the stuff to do with Faust, that Faust is sort of, he sold a soul, but I also think that actually Jesus, at the time of the crucifixion, I think that he let his soul sort of travel on, and that he states that he's still alive. I believe that he is still with us, and I think all of the evidence is saying, well, he didn't actually die on the cross anyway. So I think everything is kind of up for negotiation, but I'm kind of looking at all of this. I'm afraid I just there's too much, sort of the old Celtic blood in me for me to say, okay, look, I'm, basically, do we roll over and acquiesce? It's just like, well, no, we don't. So I mean, we have.
No, but that's
Yeah.
I mean, I was aware that there's a possibility of a confusion there. Like, resist not evil doesn't mean you acquiesce. It's just how you approach it. Like, for example, with the mRNA things, I didn't resist that program. I simply didn't acquiesce. I didn't go along with it, and I would hide, I would run, I would dodge, I would do everything. If it came to actually being held down, I suppose I would resist. But is that resistance of evil? I mean, I'm in danger of splitting hairs here, but it's one thing to actually have clear boundaries in one's own life, in one's own body, and say no to things. It's quite another to actually be part of a resistance which is trying to push against the thing that we feel oppressive. So the way I understand resist not evil is compatible with being a warrior, is being a martial artist kind of warrior, however, who always uses the opponent's energy against them, rather than actually giving energy to the opponent by resisting it directly.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's the way forward. It is that concept of using their own power against them is the way that we need to be sort of picking our way through. I mean, I'm kind of reading the likes of Campbell and his hero's journey, the likes of C.S. Lewis, and that hidden strength about people sort of regaining their personal sovereignty, and you know, to sort of, you know, to basically I mean, the only way we can win is you know, it'll be ourselves, you know, it's sort of taking ourselves out of the situation. But you know, it's going to be just it's a different kind of a format. I mean, we're walking into sort of an unknown kind of an area. It's nothing like this has been done that we know of in our lifetime, you know, sort of, but we know that history as we read it is a complete invention. You know, you look at sort of people like there's an interesting guy on YouTube, Jason Brashears, and Archaics, and he's really digging into the whole history thing, as is Michael Tessarian. But there's another concept, which is something that I've just started reading about, and I'm not really sort of, I don't have any tangible kind of a real massive connection to it, but it kind of resonates with me in a certain way. Is some people have mentioned the likes of describing this as being Lucifer's revenge. And but this is something I'll not ask you about this because it's sort of it's from another author. It was a guy called Gary Wayne had mentioned this to do with his Genesis book, and it's an interesting concept because what he basically sort of says, well, it's the you know, that Lucifer was hacked off, that he was thrown out of heaven. So he's going after all of the goodest and all of the best sort of characters, the best candidates for heaven, and he's sort of pulling them down with his concepts, basically to take them to the bowels of hell. And that's why we're being saddled with these narcissists. So it's an interesting concept, but again, it's something that requires some level of further study for me, anyways. But it's an interesting concept. So. Yeah, but it's yeah. Look, thank you so much. Do you have any other thoughts that you'd like to share, just to sort of leave us with, Jason? Because I really appreciate you taking this time to talk us through these concepts, because they're huge subjects, and I can only by going through and reading your books, you kind of realize how important these are. The Vice of Kings for me was just an amazing book. I mean, I'd read another book by called James Tunney, and again, he's talking about the same things as you are in his sort of Ireland. I don't know who she is, but in a concept, in a sort of in a brief kind of a way, he mentioned basically that for us to break out of the grid was to connect to our soul, to connect with the spirit within the land, and to separate ourselves, and then just be free in ourselves. And that is our way to step forward out of this situation.
Yeah, so that's echoing what I said. I guess that's why you're saying it. And I think, well, so I think to say one thing then before we end, which maybe we'll finish an unfinished point about your question about what's the solution, and my point's about information and knowledge. That yeah, we're not in a credit system. We're not in a spiritual credit system like this. You know, the crazy social credit system of the Great Reset and all that some of us see coming. That's already half implemented. It's not even the counterfeit of a real metaphysical, I don't think. I mean, maybe it's trying to simulate something like karma points, but I'm not an Eastern mystic anyway, so I don't know if I think a great deal of karma. That idea, I mean, karma simply means cause and effect. So of course there are consequences for our actions, and it's very like a spiritual life, quote unquote, I would say has more than anything to do with what I call it observing the law of matter, which is taking responsibility and gradually becoming more and more cognizant of, conscious of, and responsible for the consequences of our actions. I mean, we are responsible for the consequences, so more aware of how we are responsible for whatever happens to us. However you slice it, it is the consequences of our actions. Now, I know there's a lot of nuance in there. If a person gets raped or murdered, it seems random. If a person gets cancer, there's all kinds of other factors. So it's not the same as hitting your thumb with a hammer because you missed the nail is very obviously a consequence of your actions. But nonetheless, if you really break it down and look closely and just think objectively about it, whatever happens to us, it's still the consequences of our decisions because we ended up there. And even if we get hit by lightning, we still made the choices that led us to that point where the lightning struck. So that can be a very broad approach to life, but also a very subtle one. It should be subtle. That we do have the power, to use that word, to become more and more consciously responsible in our behavior so that the consequences don't take us by surprise and that we become more responsible people or human beings or souls. So there is something accumulative in that, in the sense that the more we allow ourselves to refer to reality and be honest about what we see and adjust our behaviors and our thoughts accordingly, the more responsible we become. And the more we counteract the force of gaslighting, we basically break the spell little by little of the gaslighting and start to interact more and more directly with reality. That can be accumulative. There is a path, quote unquote, on which we make progress, quote unquote, but that's very individual and it can't really be quantified. And it certainly can't be universalized. Like what would work for me there wouldn't work for you, because we have very specific customized delusions that we need to get free of. The idea that the spiritual path or that life is somehow accumulative and that it has to do with points, like I say, this idea of a spiritual credit system, I'd say is what's false. And that we can't just amass enough points to get to heaven or to get enlightened or to get out of here. We can't just gather the knowledge that we need that will then see us through and out of this web of deceit. To some degree, it will obviously be helpful to know the difference between a pitchfork and a shovel. Is very important to know the difference between poisonous plants and nutritious plants. Is useful to know the difference between a version of history that's complete bullshit and a version of history, revisionist, no doubt, or almost certainly, that maybe even it's been criminalized, and then well, probably really is some truth in this one. But anyway, not to go out on that limb just yet. These things can all be useful, but they're not. Again, it's very individual. Like what we need to get clear of. Like neither you or I nor anyone can figure out every single conspiracy or every single false narrative. We just can't do it. Nobody lives long enough, and even collectively, nobody's going to write the true version of history before this whole show ends. It's not going to happen. So then the counterpoint to that is that why we do what we do is not quite what we think it is. Like, I don't write these books because I really think I can literally map hell. It's just that's the metaphor that I came with, and insofar as it's true, like I'm mapping hell by looking at society, it doesn't mean I'm literally mapping even the social hell, but it might mean that I'm somewhat literally mapping the hell in my own nervous system, which is to say all the ways in which my nervous system was traumatized, co-opted and compromised, isn't functioning correctly to distribute consciousness through the body, so the soul cannot land. That, if I can map that, not that I will then have a map that I can then fix my nervous system, but that the act of actually trying to map the hell in my own nervous system will inevitably lead my consciousness into these places that I'm trying to map without my knowing it. So when I write about Vice of Kings, I'm going all into my past and my childhood, even the stuff I don't remember, especially that stuff, and the hidden traumas and so on that extend out to Jimmy Savile and the Fabian Society and Crowley and all these other world figures. But it's all coming back. My reference point is always my body, so it begins and ends with the body. Prisoner of Infinity, Alien Abduction, 16 Maps of Hell, Seen and Not Seen, Hollywood, and so on. But what are all the different ways that I've been given a turd and been told it was a chocolate bar, and I need to vomit out all that shit so I can finally enjoy a chocolate bar again, to use your analogy. That all of that, that's a true process, I believe. So ideally, my books are they're maps of hell, but they're my maps of hell that you can see. But to have an example of how this is done, but what really counts is have they led over time to a more and more embodied, ensouled, harmonious, peaceful existence, life? Have they allowed me to live life more fully and more to my satisfaction? Or not. In other words, have they worked? That's the acid test, not how many reviews on Amazon, how many copies are sold, how influential they've been, or even how good or how accurate they are as books. Although that last obviously is a very important factor. But I don't generally hear from people who say, oh, your books were so useful for the information because it led to this and that. I do hear from some people like that, but mostly what I hear and what is most pleasing to hear, which seems like it's most closely approximates what I was trying to do, is this just helped me to actually find my own way in my life, to find my way back to things in my own life, and to resolve things because I could see myself in your story. That's closer to what's going on there. So then it becomes a communication between souls. I'm in hell, you're in hell. I'll go, look, this is what it looks like over here. What's it like over there? Oh, good. Well, thank you. The way that you found your way right out of that corridor is giving me a sense of what my corridor might look like, because I'm still in the dark. And then they test it, and oh, sure enough, yeah, I found my way through that corridor, and so on. So then there's a collective immersion from the dream nightmare of gaslighting that we've all been lost in, that is happening at a soul level. And the other books are they're messages in the bottle, really, from one island to another.
Yeah, look, beautiful words, actually, Jason. So, and there's a few things that have come up for me just in that final statement. Basically, sort of it takes us back to sort of, we kind of have to be our own heroes. What I sort of see in your work, and I'm sorry to have, this is something that you'll feel it, because you've been through an awful lot. Your brother was through an awful lot too, and the impact that it had on who you were as people. It sort of, to what, from the outsider looking in, it's specifically with the Vice of Kings, it shows your own steps along the path of a lifelong trauma response to this Fabian narcissistic issue from your early childhood. And if anything is a warning to the likes of the powers that be that are saying that this is fine, actually just to present them a copy of your book and say, look, this is somebody who is really lucid, who has gone through hell and high water, and had to re-examine every molecule of their own self and who they were and all of their connections, and trying to pull themselves out through the quagmire. And it's been a lifelong trauma response for you, and more power to your elbow for it. Your brother went another route, and that's the two sides of the coin to this whole situation. We were talking about gaslighting, interestingly, and also the reset, and we were having, I was talking about this to a friend of mine last night, and we were discussing the meaning. This is gaslighting, the meaning of the word reset. We hear about this; it's on the tip of everybody's tongue, and we look up the word gaslighting, and it says, or reset, and it says to set again, to change the reading off, to adjust, according to a contractual agreement at the end of a preset term. That's what's in our dictionary. But if you look at the Black's Law dictionary, this is what Mr. Schwab, Satan Claus, is actually saying. Whenever he says reset, according to the Black's Law dictionary, it says the act or an instance of knowingly receiving stolen goods and the harboring or sheltering of a criminal or outlaw, a resetter. This is gaslighting. So, and we think that we're speaking the same language, but in reality, we might be using the same words, but there's very different meanings.
Yeah. Well, when you were saying that, I remembered that when I was working on Vice of Kings, I was in touch with family members, a couple anyway, who were willing to talk to me, or maybe only one actually, not counting my sister. And she was in touch with the larger family, the Horsley family that I was writing about. And so, including Baron Haskins, who I write about as a living family member who seems to be involved in these agendas to this day. Excuse me. And she asked him if he was bothered by what I was doing. And his response was, apparently I heard, was, no, nobody's going to read it anyway. Which hasn't been proven entirely untrue. I mean, it's certainly, I don't know how many copies it sold, but it's certainly only in the hundreds, not in the thousands. But some people have read it. But I think I can infer from that he didn't read it, and he didn't. You never know. He might have just looked in the index to read what I said about him. That's possible. But I certainly don't think he was interested in knowing about how the agendas had negatively impacted me and any of the stuff that you're implying. It would be nice to think that people behind these agendas did have some sort of conscience that could be awoken, and I'm not going to rule it out, but I don't think we should count on that.
Wow, and thank you very much, Jason. That's that's my own thing. Is these people don't have conscience. If they see your trauma, they're feeding off it. It's they're we're different animals. But bearing in mind, I mean, the story about this, from what I've gathered, is whenever these guys have this walk in, this evil that is running them, that's this Mephistopheles, is this demon that inhabits, which gives these guys all one personality. That demon walks away whenever they die alone, because Mephistopheles, he doesn't die with them. And it's just them and their 2-year-old or their 4-year-old self, the spoilt brat that decided that they were going to do whatever they could to get their way, and regardless of who was going to have to pay for it. So it's big topic. So look, thank you very much for joining us.
Oh, well, you're welcome. Thanks, Josie.